Vertebrae are the individual bones of the spinal column. They support your weight and protect your spinal cord. There are three groups of vertebrae that remain separate throughout life: cervical in the neck, thoracic in the chest, and lumbar in the lower back. There are two other groups that start to fuse in puberty and become single bones: the sacral vertebrae, of which there are 5 that join together to form the sacrum, and the coccygeal vertebrae that fuse to form the coccyx or tailbone. The models show 4, but it varies from person to person. It can be anywhere from 3 to 5 of them. There are 7 cervical vertebrae, so 7 in the neck. This is true for all mammals, anything from a tiny mouse to a giraffe. So giraffes' necks, despite their length, are not very flexible. They only have 7 joints in them. Thoracic vertebrae, there are 12. On a skeleton, you can recognize them by the attachment of ribs. Lumbar vertebrae, there are 5. So think of meal times, even if it's not when you actually eat. Breakfast at 7, lunch at 12, dinner at 5. The vertebrae all have the same basic parts. The body is the large stacking portion. These are flat, top and bottom, rounded across the back. The further down you go on the spine, the larger the bodies get because they're supporting more and more weight. The vertebral foramen is the hole for the spinal cord. And then there's a spike called the spinous process. This comes out to the posterior, and you can feel these along your back through most of the length. There are some additional parts. Transverse processes. These are part of how the vertebrae articulate with each other and with ribs. And then superior and inferior articular processes. You may also see the words pedicle and lamina, which are the parts of the bone that form around the vertebral foramen. The pedicle is here where it attaches to the body, and then lamina out here. From the side, you can see holes or indentations reaching up. When the spine is together, those form gaps called an intervertebral foramen, and that's where spinal nerves come out to spread out to the body. Cervical vertebrae only have an additional structure called transverse foramen. When you need to identify which region a vertebra came from, the first thing you want to look for is how many holes does it have. If there are 3, it's cervical. If there's only 1, then it's either thoracic or lumbar, and you need to look at a few other things. Before we look at thoracic and lumbar, there are 2 cervical vertebrae we need to take a closer look at. Now, most of your vertebrae don't have names. They have a number and a letter. So C for cervical, T for thoracic, L for lumbar, even S for sacral, and then 1, 2, 3, etc., going from top to bottom, superior to inferior. C1 and C2 are unique, and they also have names. C1 is called the atlas. This is named for Greek mythology. Same guy that gives us the word atlas for a map. He's a titan who carries the world on his shoulders. The atlas carries your head on its shoulders. These little cradles here are where the occipital bone fits in. Now, the atlas has no spinous process, no body, and a very large vertebral foramen. The reason for that is C2, the axis. From the top, it looks pretty basic. From the bottom, it's even more so. You've got a body, vertebral foramen, a short spinous process, 2 transverse foramina, so you can tell it's cervical. But look from the side, and here's the identifying feature. This is called the dens, which means tooth. This bone is called the axis, as in axis of rotation. This dens fits into the vertebral foramen of the atlas, and then it can twist. So this joint is what lets you twist your head and say no, more than you can twist any other part of your spine. Okay, so axis, dens, atlas. And then other cervical vertebrae are just C3 through 7. Now, to distinguish thoracic from lumbar, if we look from the posterior, thoracic is much more delicate in appearance. Lumbar is more chunky. From the top, we can see the lumbar has a much larger body, although if you went from T12 to L1, the difference wouldn't be as big because it's just one vertebra removed. Now, the spinous process of thoracic vertebrae tapers to a point, and it usually angles downward. Spinous process of a lumbar vertebra is closer to horizontal, and it has a blunter end. The other processes on a lumbar vertebra are much chunkier. On the thoracic vertebra, you don't even really see these lower ones as much. This looks like a giraffe head, right? You've got the nose, ears, the ossicones, which is the technical term for the horns. So think thoracic giraffe, where the lumbar is more like a moose. You've got the snout, jowls, antlers. So think lumbar, big lumbering moose. Okay. So that's how you can identify which region a vertebra comes from. On the sacrum, there are a couple of different terms. And we can't see the vertebral foramen on this model, but there would be a channel here that's called the sacral hiatus. That's where the spinal cord continues through. The intervertebral foramina fuse to make these holes that go front to back. The spinal nerves would come out the sides and might have some anterior and posterior portions. The top of the body we call the sacral promontory. These sides have these rough edges, and this is where the hip bones connect. So this is your sacroiliac joint that forms the pelvis between 2 hip bones and the sacrum. Here is the end of the sacrum. From the anterior, which is the concave part, you can see ridges where the separate vertebrae used to be. On the posterior, you've got slight bumps from their spinous processes. The coccyx, C-O-C-C-Y-X, is your tailbone, made of 3 to 5 fused vertebrae. There are muscles that attach to it, which is why we still have one despite not having tails. Okay, so coccyx, sacrum, and that's your spinal column.